When you think about ancient Egypt, your mind probably jumps straight to the highlights, right? The pyramids standing guard over Giza, the blinding flash of gold from Tutankhamun's tomb, the regal faces of the pharaohs staring into eternity.
It's majestic.
It's mysterious, it's romantic, it's spectacular, but that romantic veneer is, in many ways, an elaborate distraction, a history designed to obscure a profoundly darker reality hidden literally beneath the feet of the worshippers.
We are talking about the subterranean geography of power. We are talking about something clinical and deeply disturbing that happened not in the sunlight of the main courtyards, but deep down. 47 steps down, carved into the living bedrock beneath the largest temple complexes, like the Temple of Ammon at Karnak.
And these weren't standard storage rooms or crypts. We are talking about specialized chambers, sealed for millennia. They were only accessible through passages designed to hide them from the world above and, crucially, from Egyptian society itself.
Exactly. And the existence of these complexes is documented not in grand hieroglyphs, but as fragmentary, suppressed records. Papyri known to scholars for over a century, but which were deliberately kept from the public.
Why?
They detailed practices considered far too dark for any public consumption, even in the context of ancient religious history.
So for this deep dive, we're going to try and understand the systematic, chillingly clinical process the priests called divine preparation. Our mission is to illuminate what that preparation entailed using the specific documentation they kept, which is essentially a procedural manual for psychological warfare disguised as temple ritual.
It's just that. It was a state-sponsored religious project focused entirely on psychological destruction and replacement. The logic was empirical.
Yeah.
Use a specific documented protocol to destroy an existing identity, create a vacuum, and then install a compliant, religiously useful persona.
Let's start by setting the scene with the central case study that anchors these fragmented records. Kia of Mitanni. The records place us around 1214 BCE during the height of the New Kingdom. Kia is 22 years old, until recently a noble woman educated in sophisticated skills like astronomy and languages. She is 47 steps below the Temple of Ammon.
And you have to imagine this chamber, Chamber 7. It's built into the earth, cold and devoid of light. She is secured to a cold black obsidian altar by thick leather straps. The records even note the sensory input, the acrid smoke of burning kefi incense mixed with something else described as organic and wrong.
What does that even mean?
It was possibly bodily secretions or decaying herbs, a smell that catches and burns in the throat.
So the atmosphere is designed to disorient, not to soothe.
Absolutely. The chanting is performed by 7 priests in a dialect so archaic that even priests of the time struggled to translate it fully. That sound, coupled with the rhythmic striking of small copper instruments laid out on a side altar, created a perpetual state of auditory stress.
And those copper implements weren't surgical tools.
No. The descriptions suggest specialized instruments designed for causing precise, transient pain. Just enough to trigger a fear response, but not enough to disable or permanently damage the subject.
And there were vials.
Yes, glass vials containing liquids. Modern analysis suggests they held substances intended to induce states she would have no words to describe. Chemical disorientation used as a tool of transformation.
She is weak, having been awake for 6 days, her stomach empty for 3. The man overseeing this, the high priest, Usuzer-Mantu, is described in the records not as an executioner or a torturer seeking answers, but as a craftsman.
A specialist in psychological engineering. He doesn't see a person, he sees raw material being prepared.
And that is the crucial, chilling context for you, the listener. This was not torture for intelligence gathering. It wasn't simple punitive cruelty.
It was transformation. The goal was the systematic destruction of her identity to create a psychological vacuum, an empty vessel capable of housing whatever religious or political identity the priest chose to place inside.
And the cost, the sheer scale of human destruction required for this endeavor, is laid bare by the success rate. The records show an 83% failure rate. Let's be clear about what failure meant. The vast majority of women who entered these chambers never emerged with their personalities intact. They became shells.
And the physical toll was devastating.
Yeah.
A staggering 61% of subjects documented died within 5 years of completing the rituals. Their bodies, weakened by trauma and constant stress, simply collapsed once the acute psychological pressure was removed. The priests clinically noted this as wasting of the body.
Which means the women who survived physically but became the present but empty, shells walking, breathing, showing no internal experience, constituted another 12%. So the true success rate, the highly functional, compliant women who became the desired oracle, the revered priestess, the vessel, was just 7%.
Just 7. This entire industrial process of destruction, refinement, and replacement, sustained over centuries, was aimed solely at producing that small fraction of compliant, functional, transformed human beings. They treated humans as manufactured goods, refining the process based on mortality and compliance statistics.
So if the goal was to produce a functioning vessel, the first question is, how did the priests select their raw material? This brings us to section 1, selection identifying the raw material. The sheer organizational structure dedicated to this process is remarkable.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how organized and specific the procurement process was. Temple complexes maintained networks of specialized scouts and priests whose sole purpose was psychological reconnaissance. They weren't general slave traders. They were specific human resource acquisition experts.
And they accompanied military campaigns into conquered or contested territories like Syria, Kush, and Libya. But their criteria were entirely counterintuitive if you were simply looking for a docile servant. They seemed to actively seek out subjects who would be the most difficult to break. Why go to such lengths?
Well, they operated on a chilling principle. The capacity of the vessel had to match the perceived power of the entity or function they intended to install. Let's detail those specific selection criteria drawn from the surviving training texts.
Okay, so first, age. Ideally 18 to 30 years old.
Right. They sought fully formed adults whose identities were already mature and resistant. They explicitly avoided younger subjects, believing the identity needed to be substantial before it could be harvested.
Second, impeccable physical health.
They needed a vessel that could endure the physical stress of the protocol. Third, evidence of prior education or training in complex cognitive skills languages, mathematics, astronomical observation, skills like those Kia possessed.
But the most crucial criterion was evidence of strong will, capacity for sustained resistance, or high intelligence.
Exactly. They believed the vessel needed to contain something powerful before it could be emptied. A woman who instantly collapsed or lacked psychological substance was deemed unsuitable because, once broken, there would be nothing left to repurpose.
That logic is ruthless. A strong identity wasn't an obstacle.
It was psychological fuel. Once the identity was broken, the enormous mental capacity and emotional energy previously dedicated to resistance could be systematically redirected to empowering the new, installed vessel identity. They were harvesting psychological fortitude on an industrial scale.
Kia's capture is the perfect illustration of this hyperspecific selection process. She was identified during the chaos of the sack of her father's fortress in Syria. The Egyptian evaluator wasn't watching the general captive movement. He focused specifically on her.
He noted her attempt to organize other women for escape and her maintained composure under immense stress. She functioned analytically even as her world was collapsing.
Her file fragment is definitive. Subject 23. Psychological profile indicates strong will, high intelligence, capacity for sustained resistance. Recommendation: transport to Karnak for full evaluation. Projected suitability high.
She was not a random victim. She was a highly prized, difficult-to-acquire candidate.
And the transport protocol itself served as the initial phase of preparation, known as coercive control stage 1. Kia's journey to Egypt took 31 days. It wasn't just a trip. It was the start of the psychological breakdown.
And this stage was designed for systematic separation and demoralization. Minimal food, enough to maintain health but not strength. Deliberate, crushing isolation. She traveled in a wooden cage, exposed to the elements, always visible but strictly forbidden from speaking with other captives or guards.
And if we connect this to modern psychological analysis, it's recognized as the first empirical stage of coercive control.
It is. The goal is to systematically cut all social connections. When an individual is isolated, their vulnerability to manipulation increases exponentially because their internal reality is no longer supported by any external validation. The priest knew a woman who arrived alone, weakened, and psychologically separated was far more receptive to the upcoming procedures.
Upon arrival at Karnak, Kia entered the 3-day pre-selection evaluation. This facility was adjacent to the main temple, ensuring security, and the procedures were highly structured.
And it began with a subtle form of manipulation. She was washed, fed a decent meal, and given clean linen, a deliberate contrast to the weeks of deprivation.
So they were setting up a pattern.
Exactly. Comfort followed by suffering. It would keep her psychologically off balance and reliant on her captors.
The examination was exhaustive, carried out by priest-physicians using standardized forms refined over centuries.
The physical assessment documented everything: height, weight, flexibility, skin condition, internal examinations. They were documenting the durability of the physical shell they intended to use.
The psychological evaluation was perhaps the most invasive. They tested her reactions to extremes: sudden noise, harsh light, non-consensual physical contact.
And they asked detailed questions about her life, family, and beliefs, recording the details for targeted use later in the protocol.
But the final screening test involved deliberate provocation.
Yes, insults directed at her family, claims about the weakness of her people or gods. They were looking for the remaining fire. The women who showed no resistance, who were already passive or psychologically collapsed, were often rejected at this stage. They lacked the psychological substance the protocol needed to harvest.
They needed a fully functional mind to break, not one that was already broken.
Precisely.
Kia's outcome from this evaluation was definitive. Identity strongly rooted in cultural and familial connections, recommending the full preparation protocol with emphasis on identity dissolution. Her projected timeline was 14 to 21 days. She was given a number, subject 147, and told her previous name was irrelevant. She was then taken down 47 steps into the deep chambers.
This evaluation process itself reveals the lack of emotion involved. They weren't judging her character. They were measuring her mental capacity for resilience, calculating the energetic cost versus the potential benefit of breaking her will.
We now move to Section 2, which is the harrowing core of this history: the 5-stage protocol systematic destruction. We have 4 main stages documented in these papyri, and they align disturbingly well with modern state-of-the-art psychological techniques of identity manipulation. Let's start with Stage 1.
Stage 1, which the temple documents called the severing. This lasted approximately 5 days, and its purpose was simple and absolute: to cut away everything that anchored the subject to her previous identity, leaving her psychologically adrift.
And Kia was placed in Chamber 7. The psychological design of the chamber is crucial.
It is. Black walls coated with pitch, designed to absorb light and sound, creating a feeling of oppressive density. There was no natural light, and the subtle perpetual darkness meant she had no way to track the passage of time.
Which immediately destabilizes the human mind's ability to maintain a continuous self-concept.
Exactly. Only the cold obsidian altar in the center with its leather restraints remained constant.
The interventions here were physical, but their mechanism was entirely psychological. The first was the meticulous total hair removal.
Every single strand on her body, using specialized copper razors and sharp pumice stones. This was an excruciating process that took roughly 5 hours.
And the specific psychological rule accompanying this immensely painful, time-consuming procedure:
No sound allowed.
no sound.
The forcing of pain suppression trained her to disconnect her internal experience, the agonizing reality of the razor dragging on her skin from her external expression. She was learning that her own emotional and physical reactions were irrelevant and dangerous to express.
It was the first act of self-betrayal mandated by the priests.
This was followed by the notorious natron bath. Natron is the harsh, crystalline alkaline compound used in mummification. She was required to remain immersed in this caustic solution for up to 2 hours.
2 hours.
The priests had empirically determined that this duration was optimal.
The physiological impact was devastating.
Oh yes. The natron caused searing chemical burns and, over time, nerve damage. Modern forensic analysis of remains shows abnormalities consistent with this repeated exposure, leaving patches of skin either hypersensitive or permanently numb. The records note that this trauma commanded complete attention. Her mind could not escape into dissociation or memory. It was forced to remain focused purely on the immediate burning reality of her physical existence.
And throughout this physical ordeal, the ideological programming began.
Repetitive chanting was used. You are being purified. The foreign woman dies so that the vessel may be born.
This is classic use of repetitive verbal content during extreme, unavoidable stress.
Right. When the mind is overwhelmed by pain, fear, and physical overload, its critical filters are lowered, making it infinitely more susceptible to suggestion and the installation of new belief structures.
Once the physical anchors were severed, the priests targeted the self directly. On day 2, Kia was required to recount her entire life story.
Her childhood, education, family, and beliefs, in exhaustive detail for hours. When she finished, the high priest informed her that everything she had said was false.
A fictional memory, a person who never existed.
And when she naturally protested, asserting the truth of her memories, the priests administered correction.
Which was?
Precise, targeted, transient pain, immediate confinement in a smaller, darker space, or prolonged water deprivation for up to 12 hours. The goal wasn't to convince her that her memories were false, but to use classical conditioning, asserting her past self equaled immediate and severe suffering.
They broke the defense of identity.
That's
Day 3 introduced induced complicity. This is a particularly insidious mechanism.
It really is. Kia was forced to participate actively in the destruction of every physical marker of her former life, melting down the gold jewelry from her dowry, burning the clothes she had arrived in, and tearing up a letter she carried from her mother.
So each act of personal destruction was an act of betrayal against her previous self?
Exactly. Modern cult and abuse studies recognize this as a potent structural technique. Forcing victims to participate in their own victimization creates a profound sense of shame and guilt, psychologically binding them to their abusers.
It reinforces the narrative that they chose the transformation.
The deeper the shame, the stronger the bond to the new identity that promises relief.
Days 4 and 5 were dedicated to memory dissolution, using cycles of sensory extremes.
This involved alternating between 8 hours of complete sensory deprivation, absolute darkness and silence, often with restraints that minimize movement, and 2 hours of overwhelming sensory stimulation.
What kind of stimulation?
Loud drums, bright shifting lights, and intense rhythmic chanting. This cycle repeated throughout both days.
And modern neuroscience explains precisely why this is so effective.
It does. Extended sensory deprivation forces the brain, deprived of external stimulus, to generate its own reality, leading to intense hallucinations and temporal distortions. Alternate that immediately with overwhelming stimulation prevents the brain from adapting to either state.
This continuous stress destabilizes the prefrontal cortex, impairing memory consolidation and shattering the sense of a continuous self. The subject loses the ability to distinguish between internal, brain-generated reality and external reality.
The records show that by the end of day 5, Kia's sense of continuous identity had become fragile and unstable. The severing was complete.
The completion of the severing created a psychological vacuum. So we move now to stage 2, the opening.
Yes, this lasted approximately 7 days and was designed to capitalize on that intense psychological fragility, creating a state of maximum suggestibility and receptivity for the new identity.
The atmosphere shifted. The chamber was larger, arranged with altars seeming to correspond to celestial bodies. Kia was often still restrained, but the focus moved from causing raw pain to achieving a targeted, altered state of consciousness.
This began with physical preparation for reception. The priest supplied specialized ointments and oils to her skin, often massaging her nerve centers. Analysis of residue found on ceramic vessels confirms the presence of psychoactive substances.
What kind of substances are we talking about?
These compounds were likely derived from known Egyptian botanicals, substances like mandrake or henbane, which contain potent anticholinergics or hallucinogenic alkaloids. Absorbed through the skin or inhaled as smoke, they would induce profound dissociative effects characterized by confusion, delirium, and a blurring of sensory boundaries.
And the priests attributed the resultant neurochemical alterations to divine presence.
Of course. But empirically, they were using ancient pharmacology to lower the subject's critical thought and blur the boundaries between herself and the environment. It made the idea of an external entity entering her mind seem logical and immediate.
They also targeted her nervous system directly. The records mention stimulating points of power.
Right, areas corresponding to high concentrations of nerve endings or autonomic response points. While not modern anatomy, centuries of empirical observation taught them how to trigger specific physiological responses like intense relaxation, anxiety, or euphoria, maximizing suggestibility during the ritual chanting.
In this chemically and physiologically altered state, the psychological interventions were maximized.
First, identity replacement narratives, continuous, soft, yet intense repetition that she was a vessel, that her previous life was an illusion, and that her true nature was only now being revealed as a designated host for a divine entity.
Then came the powerful deity invocation sequences.
This is where priests stopped addressing Kia by her former designation, Subject 147, and started speaking through her. They addressed her by the divine name they had chosen for her, Mutamiheb. They treated her body as a sacred space already partially occupied by the divine power.
This was heavily supported by possession simulation.
Yes, she was shown other women who had successfully completed the protocol, speaking in altered voices, acting as though they were channeling divine entities. This provided powerful social proof.
It's a demonstration of the expected and desired end state, confirming that the impossible was real.
And finally, the boundary dissolution exercises. She was continuously touched by multiple priests while being told she could not feel where her individual body ended and the divine presence began. They compelled her to repeat phrases denying her individual existence.
The goal was to induce a full, sustained, dissociative state.
The literal breakdown of the integration of consciousness, memory, and identity, creating the opening the priest needed to install the replacement persona.
And the records show that by the end of this 7-day stage, Kia had stopped resisting.
She stopped asserting her own identity and started spontaneously speaking the phrases and divine names the priests had taught her. The vacuum was filled. She was ready for stage 3, the binding.
The binding took approximately 2 to 3 days, and its purpose was structural, fixing the new identity in place and preventing any spontaneous return to the previous self.
Right. The intense destruction was complete, but this stage was the concrete hardening around the new structure, ensuring permanence.
This is where the ancient empirical techniques align most clearly and chillingly with modern behavioral science, specifically classical conditioning.
Yes. They use pain association precisely to weaponize memory.
How so?
When Kia recited phrases describing her previous identity, her original name, her family, her home in Mitanni, she was immediately subjected to sharp, transient pain, often delivered through the copper implements or sudden isolation. The priests understood that merely thinking of her past self would eventually trigger the automatic anticipation of pain, creating a conditioned, visceral aversion.
And conversely, they established reverse association, a positive reinforcement loop.
Exactly. When she spoke in her new vessel identity, Mutamahib, she was immediately given relief: water, small amounts of food, warmth, and supportive physical contact. The new identity became automatically associated with comfort, security, and the cessation of suffering.
This created a powerful self-reinforcing loop.
The old identity became dangerous and painful, something the brain needed to repress for self-preservation, while the new identity was essential for survival and reward. This is psychological engineering at its most basic and most effective.
The binding was solidified with social reinforcement.
Successful vessels were brought in to interact with the new initiate, treating her as a fellow vessel, welcoming her into a community that accepted only the new identity.
The power of group belonging to cement identity cannot be overstated.
No, it can't. Humans define themselves through social relationships. By providing a new, exclusive community that validated only the transformed state, the priests created immense social pressure that solidified the vessel persona as the new, functional self.
Kia's binding took 3 days, which the records noted indicated her exceptional psychological resilience, now successfully redirected to vessel integration.
The final step was stage 4, the completion, the ritual finalization, which usually took 1 day. By this point, the psychological work was complete, but the social and religious transition needed formal recognition.
The ceremony took place in a larger, decorated chamber. She was cleansed, dressed in white linen, and adorned with gold jewelry, publicly marking her as sacred temple property.
Transition from foreign captive to Egyptian divine asset.
The ceremony included the tests, where she was required to demonstrate her transformation.
Priests would present her with sensitive stimuli from her past life, perhaps the name of her father, a specific constellation she studied, or a familiar tune from Mitanni, and she had to show genuine confusion and no emotional recognition.
And the records confirm that Kia passed these tests flawlessly.
Whatever Kia of Mitanni knew, Mutamahid did not.
And then she was received into service through rituals that the texts identify as union with the divine and establishment of the vessel's function.
The texts imply that her body was used both ceremonially and physically in ways that marked her new status and established her connection to the divine power she was now supposed to channel, completing the transformation from captive to oracle.
So Kia emerged on the 15th day as Mutamahib.
She served 11 years, dying at 33 from a wasting of the body without visible cause. This clinical description is consistent with the long-term effects of sustained, extreme psychological and physical trauma.
The body simply failed after the mind had been fundamentally restructured.
She never spoke her original name again.
The story of Kia is terrifying, but the records we have aren't just one anecdote. They are a centuries-long clinical log. We now need to look at Section 3, the range of outcomes, because the stories of 4 other vessels reveal the extreme nature of these protocols and sometimes the unexpected resilience of the human mind.
Let's start with Nefertari of Kush, the resistor. She was brought to the Luxor complex around 1170 BCE, 25 years old. She is noted as having an exceptional resilience, even greater than Kia's, meaning the priests saw her as a potentially massive success.
Nefertari resisted the standard severing and opening protocols at every turn.
She refused to stop speaking her name, despite the conditioning pain. She forced the priest to perform the destruction of her possessions themselves while she watched, refusing the induced complicity stage entirely. By day 12, the priest documented their extreme concern. Subject maintains identity coherence beyond all recorded precedent. Standard protocols insufficient.
Her psychological strength forced the extreme measure.
She was subjected to complete isolation for 19 consecutive days, documented in a seal papyrus. No food, minimal water, absolute darkness, and zero human contact.
Modern analysis suggests complete psychological breakdown usually occurs in 7 to 14 days. Nefertari lasted significantly longer.
Which proves the initial assessment of her high will was accurate. The record of her breakdown is terrifyingly detailed, serving as a progress report for extreme conditioning.
What does it say?
Days 1 to 10. Verbal resistance, shouting her name and lineage, demands for release. Then days 6 to 10, she began talking to herself, reciting memory maintenance exercises in her native Kushite language, struggling to hold on to her external markers of self.
And then?
Days 11 to 14. Silence, sitting motionless, a sign of psychological withdrawal. Days 15 to 18. Repetitive behaviors, non-recognition of the brief interruptions by the guards.
On day 19, she finally signaled compliance.
She adopted a posture of submission and spoke the divine name assigned to her. She emerged as Hathor Makhet and served for an impressive 27 years.
However, the records contain a fascinating caveat.
Unlike Kia, Nefertari's true self was never entirely erased. The texts note occasional recurrence of prior patterns, speaking specific phrases in the Kushite language, or momentary flashes of failure to recognize people in her vessel identity. A profound psychological fissure remained, a ghost of Nefertari lurking beneath the surface of Hathor Makhet.
Our second case is Isetnefret of Canaan, the fragile subject. Seized as punishment for her father's offenses, she arrived at the Memphis temple at age 19.
The evaluators noted a crucial flaw. She had insufficient psychological development. She hadn't yet fully formed the strong identity the protocol was designed to harvest.
But the priests proceeded anyway.
Yes, under pressure to meet quotas for high-value vessels. However, she failed dramatically during stage 2, the opening, on day 8. She suffered a sudden physiological crisis described as physical failure during divine preparation. Her body simply could not endure the chemical and psychological stress required.
What's significant about Isetnefret's death is the aftermath. It sparked the only recorded protocol reform in 3 centuries of practice.
And the chilling logic of this reform is what matters. The priests didn't question the severity of the protocol itself. They concluded that the raw material was unsuitable, revising the evaluation criteria to explicitly screen out subjects under 20.
This highlights the absolute dehumanizing nature of the entire process. Isetnefret was not seen as a human loss,
but as a manufacturing error. The failure required not a moral reassessment, but a refinement of the selection parameters industrial quality control to ensure better durability in the next batch of raw material.
Next, we have Tezzeret of Libya, the deceiver. She's 28, a widow, captured after Egyptian military operations.
Critically, she was psychologically sophisticated and had heard stories of the rituals during transport. She developed a brilliant and terrifying plan: internal survival through external deception.
So she pretended to break.
She resisted in the expected ways, performed the necessary compliance behaviors, and emerged as the perfect vessel, Rahab. Internally, however, the record suggests she maintained her original identity for 6 months while performing flawlessly.
She was executing a perfect years-long internal operation.
Her true self was revealed when she attempted a nearly successful escape during a major temple festival. She was recaptured and questioned under duress.
The priest's reaction was sheer, unmitigated panic.
They marked it immediately as an unprecedented security failure. If Tezzeret could fool the system for 6 months, it meant the entire process of identity destruction was fundamentally vulnerable.
The punishment was designed to be an absolute unchallengeable warning.
Tezzeret was subjected to 40 days of specialized intervention, documented in a sealed papyrus, involving senior priests from multiple complexes. These procedures went far beyond identity destruction. They were designed explicitly to destroy her capacity for coherent thought and basic cognitive functions.
We don't have the specifics of the 40 days, but the result is horrific proof of the priest's intentions.
After 40 days, the records indicate Tazaret was no longer capable of speech. Not that she refused to speak, but forensic linguistic analysis of the papyri suggests the language centers of her brain had been targeted and damaged beyond recovery.
By a sustained trauma and sensory assault.
Yes. She lived for 3 more years a warning, dying at 31, body without a functioning, coherent mind left to direct it.
Finally, let's consider Meritin of Syria, the ambiguous success. Captured at 21, the daughter of a Syrian priest, she was identified as having an unusual capacity for internal dissociation.
Possibly pre-trained in spiritual or ritual practice. She flowed through the protocols without resistance, which, ironically, worried the priests more than outright resistance, as they feared she might be protecting a core identity the Severin couldn't touch.
She was assigned as Neithmakhet and became one of Egypt's most renowned oracles for 17 years, celebrated as the greatest success because her prophecies were consistently accurate.
Pharaohs and commoners alike consulted her for decades. But here is the secret interpretation we found in the private document of an observing priest.
What did he write?
He wrote, "When she prophesies, she is not channeling the goddess Neith. She is channeling the foreign woman she was before her preparation."
So he believed she was faking it.
He believed Meritin used the vessel identity as a survival shell, a perfect public performance that allowed her to channel her superior Syrian education, strategic intelligence, and astronomical knowledge while pretending to be an empty vessel of the goddess.
This raises the ultimate question of this entire system. Was Meritin the greatest success because the temple gained a valuable asset, or the greatest failure because the original occupant remained fully intact?
Running the entire elaborate operation from beneath the manufactured facade, the priest chose not to report his findings, stating that exposing her would only reveal a failure in the protocol they couldn't detect or control.
Meritin died at 30, taking the truth with her.
This case fundamentally questions whether total psychological erasure is ever truly possible for the most resilient minds when given a perfect motivation for internal deception.
This history is not just speculation based on disturbing texts. It is confirmed by physical evidence left behind in the ruins of the temples. Let's move to Section 4. Modern validation, the evidence that confirms.
The physical evidence provides a terrifying form of validation that connects the clinical papyri directly to the architecture of the temples. Starting with Karnak in 1923, archaeologists discovered the seal complex 47 steps down, chamber 7 containing cold, black obsidian slabs with leather attachments,
Exactly matching the descriptions of the altar and straps used for confinement in the texts.
And crucially, they found skeletal remains within these chambers. Forensic analysis performed later revealed bone abnormalities consistent with prolonged confinement and specific forms of physical intervention.
We're talking about evidence of extended immobilization in specific positions and repeated, targeted trauma over months or years.
And the age range of the deceased, 20 to 35, was entirely consistent with the target demographic described in the temple text.
At Luxor in 1954, chambers were uncovered containing stone basins with residue of natron solutions.
Chemical analysis verified the presence of the caustic alkaline compounds at concentrations that would indeed cause severe chemical burns on prolonged contact, confirming the existence and nature of the painful natron baths described in the Severing Protocol.
In Memphis during the 1970s, excavation revealed burial sites associated with low-status temple personnel.
Isotopic analysis of the bone collagen confirmed that these individuals were non-native Egyptians, originating from Canaan, Nubia, and Libya, the exact source regions for the captive women.
These were definitively the failed subjects, the 83% who didn't survive or remain functional, buried without honor.
And finally, pharmacology provides confirmation for the opening stage. Analysis of residue found in the ceramic vessels identifies psychoactive substances consistent with compounds like datura or henbane alkaloids that would induce profound dissociative effects.
When absorbed through the skin or inhaled as smoke, this confirms that the divine presence the priests claimed to be invoking was often, at least partially, a neurochemical state intentionally induced by ancient pharmacological knowledge.
So if the archaeology confirms the physical environment and the chemistry, the psychology confirms the effectiveness of the methodology.
It's the aha moment for the listener. These ancient techniques are recognized and named today in the context of psychological manipulation and identity modification.
Precisely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the ancient protocols align perfectly with modern research into identity attack and coercive control. The severing is a classic identity attack, the systematic degradation of the beliefs and connections that maintain a coherent self. We see similar methods used today in military training, where the goal is to break down the civilian identity and install a new soldier identity.
One based on absolute obedience and a new locus of control.
The priests knew empirically that breaking down the belief in existing external support structures, family, home, religion, was necessary before installing new doctrine.
By forcing Kia to betray her memories and destroy her possessions, they created a situation where her only remaining anchor was the system that was abusing her.
The opening is the creation of a dissociative trance, an altered state of consciousness that breaks down the normal integration of perception and memory. This state, induced by pharmacological substances and sensory extremes, creates maximum openness to new beliefs, similar to what is seen in extreme religious conversion experiences or cult induction.
Where reality boundaries are intentionally blurred.
And the binding is pure, systematic conditioning, the systematic association of specific thoughts, past identity, with pain, and specific behaviors, new identity, with relief.
This is the same basic mechanism used in therapeutic treatments today for trauma or addiction, but applied here for malicious replacement rather than beneficial modification.
The key difference, the terrifying takeaway, is the combination and the intensity. Modern practices might use these techniques for modification or installation of new skills in a contained environment. The Egyptian priests used them explicitly and systematically for identity replacement over sustained periods, combined with physical trauma.
Modern research confirms that the human sense of identity is not an unchangeable fixture.
Not at all. Under sufficient, sustained, and systematically applied pressure, physical, chemical, and psychological, the psychological structures that maintain the continuous sense of self can and will fragment, allowing genuinely different modes of self-experience to emerge.
The priests, through centuries of empirical observation, developed a reliable scientific process for achieving this fragmentation.
They didn't need neuroscience. They only needed the patient, meticulous documentation of cause and effect to manufacture a useful psychological state.
This deep dive forces us to confront a terrifying reality of ancient power, a scale of operation involving approximately 300 women per year, subjected to intensive preparation across centuries of the New Kingdom.
They were not willing participants. They were captives, processed like raw material, manufactured into finished products against their will.
Their silence in the historical record was not accidental. It was the entire goal. The preparation protocols were designed to erase not just individual identity, but the memory that a person had ever existed in the first place.
Ensuring that even if the individual escaped, their story would be lost to history.
But we know their names, thanks to the very records the priests kept in the darkness. And they deserve to be remembered not as vessels or priestesses, but as the women they were before the preparation. Kia, Nefertari, Nefret, Tezzeret, Meritin.
The protocols have not been used for over 2,000 years, but the knowledge that such radical psychological transformation is possible persists in these texts. The real hidden history is not that the priests believed they could channel gods, but that they developed a reliable, empirical process for systematically destroying the human mind and replacing it with something else. It is a terrifying confirmation that even the deepest, most cherished sense of self can be engineered, constructed, and destroyed. It makes you wonder, if a captured woman like Tezzeret could fake compliance and run a 6-month internal deception operation to survive, what other forms of psychological survival might be hidden in historical records we still don't understand?
What does that say about the inner complexity of the minds of captives throughout history?
And if Meritin, the greatest success, was secretly channeling her original foreign intelligence for 17 years, what does it truly take to erase a person? Is total psychological erasure ever fully possible if the human mind finds a way to hide even its own core identity from its tormentors? That question of the absolute limit of psychological control is the final piece of hidden history locked beneath the temples.